What comes to your mind when you hear the name Israel? War? Conflict? A constant fight for survival surrounded by enemies? You're not wrong. Israel is a small nation, always battling to exist. But what if I told you that's not the full story? That, beyond the barbed wire fences, beyond the airstrikes and war-torn skies, lies a very different Israel. An Israel that not only defends the Jewish people, but also reaches out to help those of other faiths. No alliances, even from so-called enemy nations. Sounds like a paradox? Then picture this: a dark night on the Syrian border. Injured Syrian children, raised to believe Israel is the enemy, are being gently carried by Israeli soldiers across the fence. Into hospitals. No cameras, no reporters, no deal to be made, just because they're human and in pain. Or rewind to 1977. As waves of Vietnamese boat people fled communism, dozens of fragile boats drifted through the South China Sea. Many nations turned them away, but one distant country in the Middle East, Israel, said, "We, who were once homeless, cannot reject them." And so they rescued, not for gain, but because they understood. Israel, a country that once faced the silence of the world, chose not to remain silent when others cried out for help. From secret missions rescuing Kurds from Saddam Hussein, to protecting Yazidis from ISIS, from opening its doors to African refugees, to silent conversations with Christian priests in Bethlehem, Israel did something no one expected. It defended the weak when the world looked away. If you think you already know Israel, this video might make you think again. Not to praise, not to debate, but to share the moments when human compassion beat politics. Because sometimes, light doesn't come from the victors, but from those who dare to reach out in the darkness. The Druze, not Jews, but BROTSRs. Some bonds aren't born from blood, but forged in fire. In northern Israel, where the misty sea, Golan Heights touch the borders of Syria and Lebanon, lives a quiet yet extraordinary community. The Druze. They are not Jewish, not Muslim, not Christian. The Druze are a small religious minority, originating in the 11th century as a breakaway sect of Shia Islam, but having developed their own distinct faith, so secretive that no outsider is permitted to know the full teachings. They live reclusively, loyal to their land and tight-knit communities. In Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, the Druze exist like a silent enigma amid a turbulent Arab world. But in Israel, they chose a different path. They took up arms to defend the Jewish state, not because they were forced, but because they volunteered. From the early days of Israel's founding, when the state was just a tiny dot on the map of the Middle East, besieged by enemies on every side, the Druze were the only Arab group to openly declare allegiance to Israel, not just with words, but with blood. They joined the Israeli Defense Forces (IDF). They fought on the northern front lines. They patrolled borders, cleared landmines, ran reconnaissance, and joined elite units. And they bled. They died. They lost their sons, just like any Israeli soldier. Israel, a country built on the memory of genocide and the instinct of never again, did not forget. The Druze were not treated as a minority to be managed. They were granted full citizenship. They vote. They run for office. They serve as generals, doctors, judges, police officers. One of the most iconic examples is General Ahmed Fairs, a Druze who once commanded Israel's elite Galilee division. He wasn't an exception. He was a symbol of a generation of Druze who chose to bind their fate to Israel with honor and sacrifice. I was born on this land. I wear the uniform of Israel not because I'm forced to, but because I believe this is the country I want to protect, said one Druze soldier. But that connection didn't end at the borders of Israel. In 2015, as the Syrian civil war raged on, ISIS, al-Nusra, and other radical Islamist groups began attacking Druze villages in southern Syria. the ancestral homeland of many Israeli Druze. Men were slaughtered. Women were threatened. Entire families fled to the mountains in desperation, while the world remained silent and Arab nations issued only diplomatic statements. Israel was the first to speak. In the Knesset, both Jewish and Druze leaders stood up and declared, "If the Druze in Syria are attacked, Israel will not stand by." Critics objected. "They're not even our citizens. This is Syria, the land of our enemies." But the Druze soldiers in the IDF responded, "They are our blood. If we shed blood for Israel, then Israel will not abandon our families." Israel quietly set up field clinics along the border. They treated the wounded, not just Druze, but anyone in need, in hospitals in Safed, Haifa, Tel Aviv. No media, no cameras. Just humanity, beyond religion and nationality. One Israeli doctor recalled, "The girl had a bullet in her belly. She was carried by our soldiers from the Syrian hillside. When she woke up, she whispered, 'Israel is the devil.' But she cried when she realized she had been saved here." In war, there is no room for pretense. Only truth and action. Today, in towns like Daliet, Al-Carmel, and Asfiya, Druze villages in Israel, you'll see the Israeli flag flying next to the Druze flag. You'll hear children speaking Hebrew. You'll see memorial stones etched with the names of Druze soldiers who died wearing the Israeli uniform. They weren't assimilated. They weren't used. They were respected because they chose to stand side by side, not because they had to, and when it was their turn to need protection. Israel did not look away. The South Lebanon Army, the forgotten Elias, not everyone who fights beside you wears your flag. But if they shed blood with you, their family, amid the rugged forests and jagged hills of southern Lebanon, a land soaked in decades of civil war, Israel found an unexpected ally, the South Lebanon Army, SLA. They weren't Jews. They weren't Israelis. They were Christians, moderate Muslims, and even Druze Lebanese who refused to let Hezbollah turn their homeland into a terrorist stronghold. They didn't fight for money. They didn't fight for fame. They fought for the hope of peace and the belief that Israel wasn't the enemy, but a possible escape from the darkness of extremism. The battlefield was never easy. From the late 1970s to the end of the 1990s, the Selah fought alongside the IDF to defend the South Lebanon Security Zone, a buffer region meant to stop Hezbollah's infiltration into Israeli territory. They patrolled with Israeli troops. They shared intelligence. They stood watch in freezing nights, faced mortar, landmines, and suicide bombers. They were the human wall holding Hezbollah back from Israel's doorstep. And in return, the rest of Lebanon called them traitors. "I didn't choose to fight for Israel," said one former SLA officer. "I chose to fight against the darkness." Then came the year 2000. Israel decided to withdraw from Lebanon. It was a strategic political decision, but for the SLA, it felt like a death sentence. Overnight, they went from allied soldiers to traitors in the eyes of Hezbollah. Their villages were surrounded. Their children were threatened. Their wives lost jobs. Their homes were burned. Many hoped, Israel won't abandon us. But no one was sure anymore. And then, something unexpected happened. No press conference, no fanfare, no international summit, just silent military trucks approaching the border, opening the gates, and welcoming old friends in the dark. Within days, over 6,000 people, SLA soldiers and their families, were brought into Israel. They carried little, a few cloth bags, some family photos, and a whispered question, "Will they let us stay?" Israel didn't just let them stay. Israel gave them a new life. They weren't greeted as heroes, but they were treated as humans. A small school in northern Israel opened Hebrew classes for Lebanese children. A makeshift clinic cared for mothers and infants who had just crossed the border. Israeli army officers who had once fought alongside them came to say, "Thank you." If it weren't for you, I might have died 10 years ago. And then, the most remarkable thing happened. Their children, the sons and daughters of Lebanon's traitors, became Israeli soldiers. Some joined the IDF. Some became doctors, engineers, programmers that they speak Hebrew more fluently than Arabic. They haven't forgotten where they were born, but they're proud of where they live now. Still, some wounds are slow to heal. Many Lebanese in exile still feel like ghosts, unrecognized by the country they fled, and never fully accepted. In the one that sheltered them, they live modestly. They work hard. And inside, the same question lingers. We fought for a belief. Does anyone still remember us? Israel hasn't forgotten. Not entirely. Every year, on Memorial Day, a small group of Lebanese gather to light candles beside the graves of fallen Israeli soldiers. Their flag isn't there. Their anthem isn't played, but gratitude is. And a friendship written in bullets, blood, and a promise never to leave each other behind. No one forced Israel to save them. But Israel did. Not for strategy, not for oil, not for UN votes. For one simple truth: if you protected me when I was weak, then when you are weak, I will protect you. The Kurds, a nation without a COU, and everyone has a flag. But everyone deserves to live with dignity. There's a people, over 30 million strong. They have their own language, culture, and identity, but no country. Scattered across Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria. They've been divided, oppressed, and labeled rebels for generations. They are the Kurds, one of the largest stateless ethnic groups in the world. They once fought ISIS, stopped extremism from spilling into Europe, gave their lives to preserve their heritage. But when they cried for help, most of the world turned away, except for one nation, Israel. The story began over 50 years ago. In the 1960s and 70s, under the iron rule of Saddam Hussein, Kurds in northern Iraq were bombed, hunted, and expelled from their villages. They had no formal army, no international aid, nothing but worn rifles and the will to not be erased. And during that time, an unlikely friend emerged. Israel, Operation Marvad, the secret mission. No headlines, no satellite images, no official statements, just covert night flights. Backpacks full of weapons, medicine, communication equipment, delivered straight to Kurdish resistance units. Israeli intelligence officers from Mossad and Special Forces crossed the Zagros Mountains to train Kurdish commanders. They taught guerrilla tactics, how to survive chemical attacks, and how to build effective resistance networks. We didn't need someone to call us a nation, a Kurdish fighter wrote in his memoir. We needed someone to treat us like human beings. Israel believed in that. Why did Israel do it? Not for oil, not for diplomacy. There were no public treaties between Israel and the Kurds, but Israel saw something familiar in them. A people threatened with genocide, a community branded as outsiders in their region, a people who only wanted to survive on the land of their ancestors. And when Saddam began dropping chemical weapons on Kurdish villages, attacks, later declared genocide by the UN, Israel did not look away. They sent medicine. They sent doctors. They helped Kurds escape to Turkey and quietly brought some to Israel for treatment. In Tel Aviv hospitals, Kurdish children, their skin burned by napalm, were cared for like they were Israeli. A doctor recalled, the boy only spoke Kurdish, but when I touched his wound, he didn't cry. He just grabbed my hand and nodded. I understood. He knew he'd been saved. But it wasn't just about saving lives. It was about forming bonds. When Kurdish fighters saw Israeli officers climbing mountains, asking for nothing but the promise that we'll help you survive, they knew this wasn't politics, it was honor. Later declassified documents reveal that Israel even helped connect the Kurds to the West, giving them a voice beyond the ashes. And in a world full of betrayal, the Kurds never forgot. When Syrian Kurds defeated ISIS in 2017, some fighters raised the Israeli flag alongside the Kurdish flag. A silent tribute. In Erbil, the Kurdish capital in Iraq, streets are nicknamed Tel Aviv as symbols of hope. Israel is the only country that never called us terrorists, said a Kurdish leader during a parliamentary speech. A nation divided by 4 countries, unrecognized by the world. And a country that almost got erased from history. The Kurds and Israel found each other through the deepest form of solidarity, the pain of isolation. In the darkness, some hands reach out without asking anything. In return, Israel had no obligation to help the Kurds, no treaty, no long-term strategic gain. Just one question: are they being killed? And when the answer was yes, Israel acted. In a world where alliances shift with every election, where sanctions and national interests drown out conscience, the relationship between Israel and the Kurds is a reminder. Morality isn't always written in UN resolutions. Operation Good Neighbor, saving Syrians in the DR Congo. When you save someone who once called you an enemy, it's not just compassion. It's the courage to rise above hatred. Since 2011, Syria descended into hell. A once peaceful nation, now shattered by civil war, bombings, and mass purges. Cities like Aleppo, Homs, Dara, once beacons of Arab culture, reduced to rubble. Children buried alive beneath debris. Hospitals turned into bombing targets. An entire generation grew up knowing only the sound of gunfire. And across the border, Israel, still considered a sworn enemy by Syria, faced an ethical question. When your enemy's children are bleeding, what do you do? Israel chose to act. No speeches before the UN, no flashy press conferences. Negotiations. Just one name: Operation Good Neighbor. It began in 2016. Under the cover of night, Israeli soldiers quietly opened the border fences in the Golan Heights. But they didn't carry loaded rifles. They carried medicine, baby formula, blankets, and bandages. They didn't ask, "Are you a spy?" They only asked, "Who is hurt the worst?" From 2016 to 2018, over 4,000 Syrians, including children, women, the elderly, even wounded rebel fighters, were taken across the border to Israeli hospitals in places like Safed, Haifa. Nahariya, once military posts facing Syria, now became sanctuaries. A girl torn open by shrapnel. A father who lost a leg in an airstrike. A pregnant mother unable to deliver because her hometown hospital was bombed. All treated for free. No one asked their real name. No one cared about religion or politics. "I taught my child that Israel is the devil," whispered a Syrian. Father, as a nurse, tucked his child in. "But today, they saved my son. I don't know what to believe anymore." And it didn't stop at the fence. Israel sent over 1,000 tons of humanitarian supplies into Syria via secret checkpoints. Rice, sugar, cooking oil, flour, diapers and baby wipes, generators, tents, school supplies, vaccines, and medical equipment. Israeli NGOs joined in, founded by doctors, rabbis, students. Some Arab Israeli doctors even requested military clearance to volunteer on the front lines, just to hear a Syrian child cry, and to do what their oath demanded: save lives. But this operation remained a secret inside Israel, because this was Syria, a nation that had launched wars against Israel, a place where textbooks still taught, Israel is the enemy who stole our land. So Israel did what was right. In silence. No logos, no medals. Only one quiet promise. We don't save them because they are our friends. We save them because they are human. Some Israeli soldiers who lost friends to Syrian shelling now spoon-fed soup to Syrian girls missing limbs. Nurses who once heard war stories from their fathers now hummed lullabies to Syrian babies in Israeli hospitals. No one ordered them to do it, but they chose to, because they believed. Not every Syrian is an enemy. Some are just victims. And they deserve to live. In 2018, when Assad's forces recaptured the border zone, the operation came to an end. The fences closed. The hospitals returned to normal, but over 4,000 lives had been saved. Thousands of tons of aid crossed into a war zone, and almost no one in the world knew about it. In a world where enemy often means abandonment in times of disaster, Israel's actions remind us humanity should not have a passport. Israel never asked, "Are you Jewish?" They only asked, "Are you in pain?" And when the answer was yes, they opened the gate. Vietnamese boat people, a promise kept. To not all great acts happen under gunfire. Some miracles begin on a tiny boat, adrift in a cold, hopeless sea. In 1975, Saigon fell. The Vietnam War ended with a painful full stop. Millions in South Vietnam were sent to re-education camps. Lives were controlled. The economy collapsed. Freedom suffocated. And so began the exodus. The boat people. Who were they? They were intellectuals. Former soldiers of South Vietnam. Mothers clutching babies. Fathers rowing into the unknown, seeking a future without prison and persecution. They boarded makeshift boats, crammed 5 times over capacity, carrying rice, photographs, and one desperate hope, that somewhere a nation would open its doors. Most didn't. Their boats drifted across the South China Sea. Many died from thirst, hunger, or pirates who robbed and raped. Some ended up in refugee camps with no future, no identity, no home. Then came one boat with 66 Vietnamese refugees, stranded off the coast of the Philippines, and no country willing to take them in. And then, one nation, thousands of miles away, with no ties to Vietnam, made a stunning decision. Israel. When Prime Minister Menachem Begin heard about the boat, he said just one thing: "We, a people once rejected by the world, once left drifting with no shelter, once pushed away from ships during World War II, cannot turn our backs on them." The Israeli government dispatched rescue operations to bring all 66 refugees to Israel. They were given homes, legal papers, the right to education and work. The reason? Not politics, not economy, not diplomacy. There was no Vietnamese community. In Israel, no trade, no strategic gain. There was only one thing: the memory of Jewish suffering. Begin had lost most of his family in the Holocaust. He knew the pain of being turned away by a silent world. He saw the desperate eyes of a mother with a baby at sea, and remembered the Jews cast off refugee ships in 1939. The first Vietnamese refugees in Israel were given homes and support. To integrate. They learned Hebrew. Their children went to school. Some became engineers, doctors, business owners. A few volunteered to join the Israeli army, quietly wearing the uniform as an act of gratitude. They weren't seen as outsiders. They were called the Vietnamese of Israel. Their story wasn't splashed across newspapers, but quietly spread from family to family. A Vietnamese family opened a small restaurant in Tel Aviv, flying both the Vietnamese and Israeli flags. A Vietnamese boy read the Torah with a hint of Saigon in his accent. A Vietnamese mother, in broken Hebrew, beamed, "My son's going to the army next month." In time, other countries followed suit in accepting Vietnamese refugees, but Israel was the first to act without hesitation, without bargains, without calculation. That decision became a moral beacon in humanitarian policy. Some diplomats called it the moral reflex of a people once forsaken. "We cannot teach humanity," Begin once said, "if we don't act with humanity." In 2015, a man of Vietnamese descent stood before the Israeli Knesset and said, "Your country saved my family from the sea. I wasn't born here, but Israel gave me a life. Today, I stand not as a refugee, but as a proud Israeli citizen." Those boat people are now grandparents. They live quietly in the Middle East, half a world from Vietnam. But in every Story they tell their children. There's one chapter they never skip. That night when the world turned away. Only one country opened its heart. Its name was Israel. In the great wars of history, people remember bombs and battles. But sometimes, a single life jacket can change the course of destiny. And in the vast sea of despair, Israel never asked, what religion are they? Are they allies? What do we gain? They only asked, do they need help? And then, they helped. Not for a deal, not for records, but because compassion doesn't need translation. The Yazidis. When Israel spoke while the world was silent, there are moments when the silence of the world becomes a crime. And there are nations who, once destroyed by that silence, choose never to be silent again. In 2014, as ISIS swept across northern Iraq, the world watched in horror at a brutality unlike anything seen in decades. Beheadings, burnings, mass executions. Not just on battlefields, but filmed and broadcast like a challenge to global morality. But among all the victims, one community was especially helpless and forgotten. The Yazidis. Who are they? The Yazidis are a small ethno-religious group living mainly in the Sinjar mountains of Iraq. Their faith blends Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Islam. They have no country, no army, no powerful allies, and to ISIS, their beliefs made them heretics, worthy of extinction. And so the massacre began. Entire Yazidi villages were surrounded. Men were executed in mass graves. Women were kidnapped, sold as sex slaves on ISIS slave markets. Children were brainwashed, turned into suicide bombers or spies. Within days, thousands were killed. Tens of thousands fled to the mountaintops without food, without water, awaiting death in 50 degrees Celsius heat. The world saw it happen and did almost nothing. The UN issued statements. Powerful nations held meetings. Many expressed deep concern. But no one reached out a hand, except one country, Israel. No diplomatic ties to Iraq, no shared border, no economic interest, no Yazidi diaspora in Israel. And perhaps for that very reason, what Israel did was pure, not for politics, just for principle. The Israeli government, from ministers to members of parliament, acted quickly. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in aid were sent. Through secret channels and coordination with Kurdish forces, Israel delivered food, medicine, and blankets to the stranded Yazidis on Mount Senjar. Jewish rabbis, Israeli NGOs, university students, all mobilized to raise awareness and demand action. The Israeli Knesset held a special session solely for the Yazidis. Survivors were invited to testify. One Yazidi woman, with tears in her eyes, said, "I was sold 4 times. They killed my brother. I begged to die, but they said, 'You don't deserve to die yet.'" The room fell silent. An Israeli lawmaker stood up and declared, "We, the people who were once herded onto trains, thrown into death camps, abandoned by the world, cannot let it happen again." A Jewish rabbi stood and said, "Protecting the Yazidis is not about politics. It is a moral duty. Just as the world should have protected Jews in 1940, we must not wait to build monuments for the dead." Israel couldn't send an army into Iraq, but it did everything it could. Medication for abused women, medical supplies for the wounded, school supplies for surviving children, to remind them that learning hadn't been stolen too. Most importantly, Israel spoke up when the world stayed silent. Yazidis, who had never even heard of Israel, wrote letters of thanks. One translated letter read, "I am Yazidi. I do not follow Judaism. I don't speak Hebrew. I have nothing to offer in return. But when the world turned its face, you looked toward us, and you saved my faith in humanity." After the war, Israel continued to push for the Yazidi genocide to be officially recognized by the UN. They submitted testimonies, evidence, and names. Not to score political points, but to stop another Holocaust from happening under the Cloak of indifference, a people once gassed and buried in Europe's death camps, now stood up and said, "We will not let others die in the silence that once killed us." Israel never asked, "Are they Jewish?" Only this, "Are they in despair?" And when the answer was yes, Israel raised its voice, because sometimes the right words, spoken at the right time, are more powerful than 1,000 bombs. African asylum seekers, compassion amid Siondaro Virus, why some acts of kindness are not applauded. Some humanitarian efforts come with a cost of division and debate. In the early 2000s, a silent migration began, not from Syria, not from Europe, but from the heart of Africa. Thousands fled from Sudan, especially the war-torn region of Darfur, and from Eritrea, one of the most oppressive regimes in the world. They weren't chasing wealth. They were just trying to stay alive. Their journey was brutal. From Sudan, they crossed into Egypt. From Egypt, they crossed the scorching Sinai Desert, where the sun burned like fire, sandstorms cut like knives, and human traffickers hunted like predators. Some were abandoned. Some were shot by Egyptian border guards, but those who survived did the unthinkable. They headed for Israel, a tiny country surrounded by hostility, often targeted by terrorist groups with no deep ties to sub-Saharan Africa. Suddenly became the final destination for dark-skinned people with no passports, no Hebrew, and no Jewish identity. They crawled under barbed wire fences into the Negev desert and waited. No demands, no protests, just one silent hope. Will this place turn us away too? Israel now faced a painful question. We, a people who were once denied safe haven, will we now become the ones who say no? The answer wasn't simple. Inside Israel, society split. Some feared job losses. Others worried about preserving Jewish identity. Some suspected this was a coordinated infiltration. In areas like South Tel Aviv, where many asylum seekers gathered, tensions ran high, protests broke out, fights erupted. Angry voices shouted, "We can't carry the whole world on our back." But even amid the storm, Israel didn't shut the door. Roughly 30,000 asylum seekers, mostly from Sudan and Eritrea, were allowed to stay temporarily. They were given food and clothing. Some were granted limited work permits. Their children were allowed to attend school. Israeli NGOs, many run by volunteers, offered Hebrew lessons, medical aid, and temporary shelter. Israeli hospitals treated pregnant Sudanese women. Jewish rabbis preached, "Asylum is embedded in the very soul of the Torah." One IDF soldier who had helped bring refugees across the border later said, "When I looked into their eyes, I saw my ancestors. No need for language. I just knew they had been chased from every border too." But there was no avoiding the hard truth. This was an ethical crisis. Israel is not perfect. Not everyone supported the government's decisions. And policymakers constantly walked a tightrope between compassion and national security. Some were deported, some detained. The Jewish society continued to ask, how do we stay a Jewish state and still act like a people who remember being refugees? But amidst all the disagreement, one fact remains clear. Israel did not turn its back. There were no red carpets, no instant citizenship. But the door wasn't slammed shut, as it was in so many other places. A boy named Daniel, born in a makeshift camp to Eritrean parents, now speaks fluent Hebrew, attends a public school, and dreams of becoming a firefighter. When asked, "Where are you from?" he replies, "My mom is from Africa, but I was born in Israel. And here, I feel safe." Not every story has a fairy tale ending, but sometimes, doing the right thing, even amid protests, is enough to remind the world that compassion doesn't have to be perfect. Israel never claimed to be an angel, but during the darkest years of Africa's silent refugee crisis, they did something many richer nations didn't dare. They opened a small door, the Christians of Bethlehem. When Israel became a silent Shilin, the holy land where Jesus was born, a community is quietly fading into silence. But in a place where no one expected protection, a silent ally continues to extend its hand. Bethlehem, the city sacred to billions of Christians. The birthplace of Jesus, where angels once sang under the first Christmas night. And today, a place where Christians are slowly disappearing, from majority to minority. 50 years ago, over 80% of Bethlehem's population was Christian, mostly Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Eastern denominations. They were priests, shopkeepers, teachers, doctors, living peacefully alongside Arab neighbors. Bethlehem was once known as the Christian capital of Palestine. But over time, they began leaving because of ongoing conflict, because economic opportunities vanished, because of increasing pressure from rising religious extremism in the region. What began as quiet migration became a full-scale exodus. Today, less than 15% of Bethlehem's residents are Christian. Some nearby towns, once purely Christian, have changed completely. Families hide their faith. They avoid hanging crosses. Some stop going to church openly, out of fear of retaliation, social exclusion, or even violence. What has the world said? Some organizations call to protect Christian heritage. Some Christmas masses are broadcast leave from Bethlehem. But most of it is just for show. Few speak out clearly. No government has made real policies to protect Christians being pushed aside in the land where Christ was born. And then, Israel, criticized from every direction, did something unexpected. No dramatic speeches, no political campaigns. Just quiet, consistent action. They granted work permits to Christians in Bethlehem and surrounding towns. Thousands were allowed to work in Jerusalem, earning steady income to support their families under economic strain. A local priest said, "Without Israel's permits, many of our families would have left long ago." They protected freedom of worship, especially during Christmas and Easter. Special lanes were opened for Christian pilgrims from Gaza and the West Bank to visit Jerusalem. Security forces ensured the safety of international visitors and local believers. Churches like the Church of the Nativity and the Holy Sepulchre were maintained and restored. When churches or Christian cemeteries were vandalized, whether by Jewish extremists or Islamic radicals, Israel often responded first. Police were sent. Investigations launched. Government funding was provided to restore sites. Israeli leaders issued apologies and vowed to preserve holy spaces. And in the shadows, there were meetings no one reported, between Catholic priests and Israeli ministers, between Orthodox bishops and security officials, between local Christian communities and Israeli authorities. No cameras, no politics, just conversations to protect what remains: faith, churches, community. Israel also continues healthcare, education, and training cooperation with Christian schools in Bethlehem. Some Catholic schools in the West Bank received Israeli funding for equipment under the condition that they promote interfaith respect. One priest from Bethlehem once said, "It's ironic, but in these times, the last protector of Christianity in Bethlehem is Israel." Not every Christian loves Israel. Not every action is flawless. But when you ask, who gives them a chance to work? Who ensures their churches aren't destroyed? Who makes sure their children go to school and their elders can still pray? The answer isn't found in international speeches. It's found at ground level. In a border gate open for a holiday. In a patrol guarding a church at midnight. Sometimes, the strongest shield is the quietest one. Israel doesn't rescue Christians with armies. It doesn't fly them abroad. It doesn't declare itself a savior, but it does let them survive. In a region where Christianity is slowly being strangled, in the very land of its birth, the story of Israel and Bethlehem is a quiet note. Not grand, not glorious, but a real shield for those who no longer have one. Ethiopian airlift, saving a lost tribe of jade. Everyone knows where they belong. But some people, even forgotten for thousands of years, still keep the flame of faith, waiting for the day they return home. This story doesn't begin with war. It begins with forgotten history in the sun-scorched hills of Ethiopia, amid villages without electricity or running water, where people traveled by ox cart and lit their homes with oil lamps, lived a small, humble community barely noticed by the world. They had curly hair, dark skin, and spoke Amharic. They lived like African farmers, but in their hearts, they believed they were Jews. They called themselves Bata Israel, the House of Israel. A faith preserved for over 2,000 years. Bata Israel claimed to descend from the ancient tribe of Dan, one of the 12 tribes of Israel lost after the time of King Solomon. They had no Hebrew Torah, no official rabbis, no connection to Jerusalem. For centuries, but they kept kosher, circumcised their boys, observed Shabbat and Passover, and most importantly, they believed that one day, someone would come to bring them back to the promised land. Instead of welcome, they faced contempt. In Ethiopia, they were called Falusha, strangers. They were banned from owning land. They were harassed, discriminated, and attacked during ethnic conflicts. By the 1980s, their situation became desperate. Famine spread. Civil war erupted. Thousands of Beta Israel died from hunger and disease. Those who survived had one final plea: please take us back to Zion. And Israel heard them. No press campaign, no global pressure, just an ancient echo of faith and a modern nation that listened. And Israel responded with airplanes. Operation Moses, 1984. A desert exodus with help from the CIA, Mossad, and Sudanese allies. Israel began secretly evacuating Beta Israel refugees from camps on the Ethiopia-Sudan border. At night, small groups were led through desert trails, avoiding military patrols and aerial surveillance. They carried nothing but ragged clothes, tattered Bibles, and one thing in abundance: hope. Over 8,000 were rescued, though more than 1,000 died en route from disease, exhaustion, or bandit attacks. Operation Solomon, 1991. A world record airlift as Ethiopia's government collapsed. Israel launched a daring and public mission. In under 36 hours, 34 Israeli aircraft flew non-stop, rescuing over 14,000 Ethiopian Jews. From Addis Ababa to Tel Aviv, on one modified Boeing 747, 1,086 people were packed in, setting a world record, including one baby born midder. On the flight to Zion, children who once scribbled in dirt with sticks now sat in classrooms. In Jerusalem, they learned Hebrew. They joined the army. They became doctors, athletes, and lawmakers. Some struggled. Some faced racism. But they had finally come home after 2,000 years of waiting. One elderly Beta Israel man, kneeling on the tarmac, wept and said, "My ancestors were exiled from Jerusalem. I thought I would die in Africa. But today, I will die in Zion, where I belong." This wasn't just an evacuation. It was a return. Not for power, not for politics, not for publicity, but because Israel believes Jews are family. No matter their skin, passport, or how long they've been gone. Of course, integration hasn't been easy. Some Ethiopian Israelis faced discrimination. There were protests, frustrations, pain, but Israel continued investing in housing, education, and equality, because this story is bigger than policy. This is about a people who never forgot who they were, and a young nation that dared to do what few would: bring back its most forgotten children. Israel didn't just save the vulnerable outside its borders. It rescued its own soul, a piece of itself lost in time. You've heard countless stories of war, hatred, bloodshed. But there are stories that never make headlines. No applause, no medals, just quiet moments. When a small nation stood up and said, "If they are suffering, we must not stay silent. From Druze soldiers on the battlefield to Yazidis stranded on Mount Sanyar. From Vietnamese refugees adrift at sea to Christians quietly clinging to Bethlehem. They weren't Jews, but they were human beings, and Israel, a country once abandoned by the world, chose not to repeat that silence. You may have heard countless stories of war and destruction, but today, perhaps you've seen something different, a side of Israel rarely shown. Not the one with tanks and barbed wire, but the one that reached across enemy lines to lift up strangers, heal the wounded, and stand with those the world had forgotten. Not to be praised, not for political gain, but simply because it was the right thing to do. If this story made you see history in a new light, if you believe that compassion needs no nationality, then we invite you. What do you think about these acts of humanity? Did anything surprise you? Did it challenge your perspective? Do you know of other stories like these, untold, unseen? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget, subscribe to our channel so you won't miss stories of history, authentic, unspoken, but worth remembering. Because in a noisy world, it's often the quietest truths that move us most. Sometimes, the brightest light doesn't come from those who win, but from those who choose to open their hands in the dark.